Chapter 7, Real Property Appraisal Methods. There are three approaches to value that the appraiser has to use: the comparable sales approach, the cost appreciation approach, and the income approach. The appraiser has to use all three approaches if at all possible. The first approach is the comparable sales approach. In the comparable sales approach, what the appraiser is going to do is going to look at comparables that are in the market that are similar to the subject property, going to make adjustments to those comparables, reconcile that, and make them as much like the subject as they possibly can. I think it's important to understand that what the appraiser is going to be doing is adjusting the comparable. And up front, let me go ahead and say that the easiest way to remember this particular approach is remember Robin Hood. Take from the rich and give to the poor. If the comparable is a better property, then you're going to take away from it, take from the rich. If the comparable is an inferior property, we're going to add to it. In doing the comparable sales approach, we're going to collect a lot of data. There are going to be two adjustments that we make once we collect all the comparables: transactional characteristics and property characteristics. It's important to note that in the transactional adjustments or the transactional characteristics, the first one is the condition of sale. That goes back to arm's length. So the first thing we have to say is, was this an arm's length transaction? Secondly, we're going to adjust for financing. Was there any kind of special financing involved with any of these comparables that might have made a price difference? And lastly, we're going to adjust for market condition. Now, market condition has to do with appreciation and depreciation. In a good market, obviously, you're going to have some appreciation that may have occurred over time. An example might be that a comparable sold 3 months ago and we've had 4 or 5% appreciation a year. We want to adjust it a little bit to get it into today's market. Once we have adjusted for the transactional characteristics, then we're going to adjust for property characteristics. But first, I think we need to talk about, in the textbook, your monthly rate of change, and that's part of your market condition. In order to calculate the monthly rate of change, we're going to take the resale price minus the original sales price, giving us a total change. I like to call this the made over paid calculation, because the total change is how much we made. We're going to take the total value change and divide it by the original price. That's going to give us a percentage. We're going to take that percentage and then divide it by the number of days that it was originally purchased for and then it later sold for, and that'll give us that monthly rate of change. The adjustment process for property characteristics will come next. Property characteristics are those physical characteristics. In other words, your bedrooms and your baths. Transactional characteristics are always going to be percentage adjustments. Property characteristics will always be dollar adjustments. And so after we've adjusted for the transactional characteristics, then we're going to jump in and adjust for the property characteristics. You always will adjust the transactional characteristics before you adjust the property characteristics. What you want to do is get it into today's market first, then you can adjust for your bedrooms and baths. What I learned a long time ago was that you can have two houses, both of them 2,000 square feet. One's a 4-bedroom and one's a 3-bedroom. And I can tell you, the 4-bedroom is still going to carry more value than the 3-bedroom, even though it's the same square footage. Once we have done the comparable sales approach, the next approach to do is going to be the cost depreciation approach. Now, the comparable sales approach is based on the principle of substitution. And as I mentioned, it's relied upon when we're dealing with residential real estate, vacant land, and small investment properties. The cost depreciation approach, however, is also based on the principle of substitution, but we use it when we're dealing with special purpose buildings. In other words, those properties where there are no comparables to use. And in the cost depreciation approach, what we want to do is separate the building from the land. We're going to set the land over here by itself, appraise it using the comparable sales approach. But when we're talking about the land itself depreciating, what we're basically saying is that when you build a house or a building of any kind, ultimately it's going to depreciate. The first thing that we want to do is first figure out what is it worth brand new today. We call that reproduction cost. Now, the appraiser is looking for reproduction cost and not replacement cost. Reproduction is identical, replacement is not. And there are a number of ways that the appraiser does it. Probably the most common is the unit comparison. And what that is the per square foot method. They can also use the unit in place, which is components, or the quantity survey. Now, the quantity survey is like a cash register tape. It's very complicated, very complex. Usually architects use it, appraisers don't. Once reproduction cost has been established, the next thing that the appraiser has to do is subtract away for all of the depreciation. Accrued depreciation is depreciation that has accumulated over time. Physical deterioration is ordinary wear and tear. Functional obsolescence is a design problem. External obsolescence is something outside the boundary of the subject property that causes the subject property to lose value. When we talk about curable and incurable, I think to identify this, anytime that you can add or replace something or fix something on a home and you can make money doing it, that's curable. But anytime that you add or repair or replace something in a house and you can't get all of your money back, that's considered incurable. You may get most of it back, but you're not going to get all of it back. Let me give you an example. Typically speaking, for every dollar that you spend on paint, whether it's exterior or interior, you typically get back $5 in value. For every dollar that you spend on landscaping, you typically get back $3 in value. For every dollar you spend on major renovations of a kitchen or a bathroom, you typically get back 90 to 95 cents on the dollar. So you get back the bulk of it, but you don't get back all of it. The way that a lot of appraisers do the cost approach is the age-life method. Every property has an economic life, 30, 40 years. And then what the appraiser has to establish is the effective age. The effective age is how old the property or the building looks. Once the effective age is established, that is the actual amount of depreciation from the building. So you're going to subtract away that effective age. For instance, if the building has an economic life of 40 years and it has an effective age of 10 years, that means 10 years out of 40 has depreciated. That means you have 30 years out of 40 remaining. 75% of the value is still remaining. Once the appraiser has established the value based on this, the next thing they're going to have to do is add back in the value of the land. Remember, the building and the land are evaluated separately. Once the appraiser has done the cost depreciation approach, the last approach to do is going to be the income approach. Now, there's two ways of handling the income approach. One is the income capitalization method. The income capitalization method is where we're taking a net income and dividing it by a capitalization rate to come up with value. I call it the formula. But in order for us to calculate our net income, I think it's important. Let's talk about how do we get to net income. The first thing that we're going to do is we're going to take the potential gross income. Now, potential gross income is calculated through either market rent or contract rent. Market rent are comparables. Contract rent are those long-term, stable, contracted tenants. And if you've got contracted tenants, you can't change that. Once we've established our potential gross income, the next thing that we have to do is we have to subtract away vacancy and collection losses. Vacancy and collection losses are simply those people that are either not there or that are not paying. In other words, they're not contributing to our income stream. When we subtract out vacancy and collection losses, that gives us effective gross income. Effective gross income is the actual money we have to pay our bills with. The bills that we have are called operating expenses, and they fall into three categories. Your fixed expenses are your taxes and insurance. Those will be items that have to be paid whether it's occupied or not. The next one is your variable expenses. Variable expenses will fluctuate with occupancy, maintenance, management, utilities, and things of that nature. And the last thing we're going to do is set money aside to replace things that break. We call that reserves. These three things as a whole are considered operating expenses. Your mortgage payment or your debt service is not considered an operating expense. Once we subtract out our operating expenses, that gives us net operating income. It is the net operating income that we capitalize on to come up with our value. In the formula, I over RV, the I is the net operating income, the R is the cap rate, and the V is value. If I'm looking for V, I want to set it aside, take my net income divided by my cap rate. Remember this, if you're given two components of this, you can always find a third by simply drawing that little triangle and just simply fill in the blanks. The other way to find value to property using income, especially your smaller income producing properties like a single family home, a duplex, or a triplex, we use the gross rent multiplier. Remember that the income capitalization approach is an annual calculation based on net income. The gross rent multiplier is a monthly calculation based on gross income and doesn't take into consideration any expenses. This is what I call my VROOM formula, V over RM. Value at the top, rent multiplier. Value, rent multiplier. If you're given 2, you can find a third. Simply extract out what you're looking for. If the value is on top, I'm going to set it aside, and I'm simply going to multiply my gross monthly rent times my multiplier. Now, the multiplier is not a percent. It's simply a number. So that is the gross rent multiplier. Now, anytime that you live in an area where rents fluctuate between summer and winter, that means you don't have a standard rent through the year, we're going to take that gross rent multiplier and change it a little bit. We call it a gross income multiplier. The gross income multiplier is annual rent, annual gross rent that's collected. So it's not like your income capitalization where you're still dealing with net income that's minus all of your operating expenses. It's still going to be your gross income. So just be aware that if you're dealing with the gross income multiplier, that's an annual calculation. And you may see it on the state examination where they give you monthly rent and tell you to calculate it by way of the gross income multiplier. So you'll have to annualize everything. And that looks like that is going to be all we have for the real property appraisal methods. That's all 3 approaches. What I'd like to do right now is go through your Chapter 7 summary with you to make sure we have everything that we need. The sales comparison approach is based on the principle of substitution and is relied upon when we're valuing residential real estate and vacant properties. Transactional characteristics include condition of sale, which means arm's length, financing terms, and market condition, which has to do with appreciation and depreciation. Property characteristics include bedrooms and baths, etc. The monthly rate of change is calculated by the resale price minus the original purchase price, which equals the profit. We take our profit and divide it by the original purchase price, which gives us a percentage of change. We take that percentage of change and divide it by the number of months between the sale. This gives us our monthly rate of change. The adjustment sequence is to adjust for transactional characteristics first. Remember, those are percentages. Then property characteristics, which are dollar values. The cost depreciation approach is based on the principle of substitution and is relied upon when there are no comps available. In other words, when we're dealing with special purpose properties. Reproduction cost includes the unit comparison approach, the unit in place, and the quantity survey method. Accrued depreciation includes physical deterioration, which is ordinary wear and tear, functional obsolescence, which is something that's outdated, and external obsolescence, something outside the subject property causing the subject to lose value. The income approach to value is based on the principle of anticipation. Using the formula, we take net operating income with a capitalization rate to find value. Remember, to find net income, we take our gross income minus our vacancy and collection losses and minus our operating expenses. Gross income is calculated by using either market rent or contract rent. Operating expenses include fixed expenses, variable expenses, and reserve for replacement. Income divided by the cap rate equals value. The gross rent multiplier is value, rent, and multiplier. Rent times the multiplier equals value. And that's the end of the Chapter 7 summary.